This is session 4 of 5 and will cover climate disclosure, data and insights, and is presented by Paul Simpson. The data challenge is a really important one. The financial system is now being asked to look at how emissions reduction will translate into climate outcomes. And this is something completely different to what the financial system is used to. Boards are heavily engaged with macroeconomic data, financial data, in order to decide on strategy, look at future risk profiles, and generally come up with the ideas that are going to be driving the company forward. Now, boards are being asked to look at climate science and data that's related with turning that science into action. CDP, where Paul Simpson is the CEO, have been specializing in this space for the last 20 years or so. It's particularly important to provide a standardized set of data so that financial institutions across the sector can use the data consistently. The Mark Carney initiative, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, brings together asset managers, asset owners, banks and insurers, all under a set of net zero alliances, which aim to really look at how to incorporate climate change decision-making alongside financial decision-making. The core objective is to integrate the approach. On that note, I'll hand over to Paul Simpson to tell you more.
I'm going to start with a provocation. I think you've already had a great one from Sarah, but that you wouldn't oversee or govern a company without good financial information and disclosure. It's not questionable. As a board, you have to have the right, not all, not too much detail, but really good financial information, and your company must be disclosing well on that. Anything else would be unacceptable. And I think we are now in the year 2000 becoming, or really in a similar place, that you can't govern a company without climate data and without your company disclosing, exactly as Sarah has said. And obviously, you'll all be aware, I'm sure that's why you're on this call, the issue of climate change and other environmental issues has become very mainstream. Some 20 years ago when we started CDP, they weren't in the Financial Times and Economist every day and every week, and today they are. And for you, it's, for financial institutions, banks and insurance companies, it is very much actually about what you're financing. So we get good disclosures on what the operations of companies. If you're an oil and gas company or mining company, the emissions from the operations are really where to focus. If you're an auto company, it's the emissions from the use of the vehicles. But as a financial institution, it's what are you financing or enabling to happen through your products and services, where the primary risk is, both financially but also reputationally. And I'll come a bit more onto this shortly. And I will end with some questions I think you should be asking your managers. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I run something called CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. We're a global non-profit organization founded in the year 2000. We really work with companies, investors, cities to encourage the measurement and disclosure of climate change and other environmental issues. And since 2002, we work with institutional investors. Today, 515, it's on the slide, investors with more than $100 trillion of assets under management. There's some double counting in there, we've tried to remove it. And through CDP, they ask for large listed companies to disclose on climate and the environment. We also have a program where large companies like Walmart and Unilever use our platform to ask their suppliers to disclose. And those large companies have more than $4 trillion annual procurement spend. Perhaps most importantly, last year, 8,400 companies disclosed through CDP on climate change, representing more than 50% of global market capitalization. We also have 920 cities and states and regions who disclose. Next slide, please, Stephanie, which really takes me to the fact that climate disclosure, environmental disclosure has become the norm. This chart shows disclosure through CDP over the last 17 years, and we've seen a 36-fold increase in climate disclosure since 2003, as I said, to these 8,400 companies. So I would argue, and I think it's very clear that this is no longer something that is sort of nice to do or you should do perhaps, but it really is expected by the investors. You're obviously representing financial services companies, but it's also expected of you and your customers, expected by society. And it's really, and I'll come on to this more, something that's becoming required, we heard about this from Sarah already, by regulation and by accounting standards. Next slide, please. Now, in the last 5 years, the biggest development on climate disclosure has been the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Many acronyms in the world of climate change, just as there are as investment. So the TCFD, and the TCFD was established at the request of the G20 finance ministers under the auspices of the Financial Stability Board, and Mark Carney, who was then Governor of the Bank of England, was chair of the TCFD, and Mike Bloomberg then became co-chair later. So the lens of this was looking at what does climate change, what are the risks that climate change presents to financial stability, obviously fundamental for financial institutions to consider that. And the TCFD then in 2017 provided a set of recommendations on what good disclosure, good climate disclosure looks like. They cover 4 key areas, four groups really of information. Firstly, on governance. How is your company governing climate risk and opportunity and the management of that? Secondly, on the strategy. How is your strategy responding to climate change? The world is changing, climate change is becoming a greater risk and opportunity. How is your strategy addressing that? Thirdly, risk management, very important for you as financial services companies. What risk management approaches do you have in place with the changing landscape of climate risk, very much as Sarah has talked about? And finally, that to be robust in disclosure, you must have really clear and strong metrics and targets. And there's some very good examples of those metrics and targets that I'll touch on in a moment. And I'll just say that I think from my perspective, having worked on climate disclosure for 19 years now, that the TCFD brought 3 real innovations to what should happen in disclosure. They very clearly recommend that climate disclosure should be integrated into your mainstream report if there is deemed to be serious or material risk. Secondly, they say that institutional investors, banks, insurance companies should be disclosing, as well as corporations who have very big physical climate footprints, so closing the loop in climate risk in capital markets. And thirdly, that you should be considering and doing scenario analysis. What do different climate scenarios in terms of warming of the planet, in terms of different policy responses, mean for your strategy? Next slide, please. So I would argue that all of you as financial institutions should be approaching the TCFD recommendations with how can you disclose everything they are asking for, where it's relevant to your organization. The CDP disclosure platform is something that you can use to help you collect and structure the data for climate disclosure. It's fair to say that institutional investors are looking for more data on climate disclosure than is expected to be integrated into your mainstream report. Obviously, you don't put everything, all of your communications in a mainstream report. So we would recommend that you do use the CDP disclosure process to collect and structure your data, and then that you then integrate the important information into your mainstream report. And just as a bit of a plug, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, which is an initiative housed in CDP, CDSB as we call it, runs something called the TCFD Hub. So if you put TCFD in Hub in Google, you'll find this straight away. There is a whole load of resources about what good disclosure looks like for in relation to the TCFD, and there's specifically a new e-learning course on governance of climate-related risks and opportunities in partnership with PwC and the World Economic Forum. And I know that there are inclusions from HSBC and others in that e-learning course to help you understand what good climate governance looks like of the company. Next slide, please. So I mentioned, and we've heard from Sarah, there are real trends towards climate disclosure becoming a mandatory requirement. And just a few of them listed here. In the EU, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive is the primary regulation requiring companies to report on environmental and social issues. That is being revised currently and strengthened. And it's very likely, I would say highly expected, that the EU will require TCFD aligned disclosure through that regulation. So that's something to watch as it develops. The UK has a green finance strategy, the UK government, and has set out an expectation that listed companies, large asset owners should be disclosing in line with the TCFD recommendations by 2022. Feels a way away, but as you know, that's only really one more or maybe two business cycles. Canada has been providing some COVID-19 loans and bailout funds for large businesses and institutional investors, and has made a requirement that anyone receiving those loans and bailout funds must commit to a TCFD disclosure. So kind of another way of driving this. And finally, Mark Carney, as he stepped down from the Bank of England, is now leading on behalf of the UK government the COP26 private finance agenda. COP26 is the UN climate change negotiations. They were due to happen this November in Glasgow, but have been postponed to 2021. And what Mark Carney is seeking to build is a whole set of regulators, policymakers, who will announce in November 2021 in Glasgow that they will make TCFD aligned reporting mandatory. So watch these developments. It's just very clear this is going towards a mandatory pathway. Exactly when, it's different in different jurisdictions, but this will be required of you at some point in the near future. Next slide, please. Now, as a financial institution, you know, often we say, well, we don't have a great set of emissions. You know, it's these heavy industry, oil and gas, electric utilities. In their operations, that's true. But as I said before, as a financial institution, it's really about how you are financing and enabling through equity investments, through your loan books, increased emissions or reduced emissions and other climate risks and opportunities. So last year, 295 financial institutions did disclose through CDP on climate change. This year, we launched a very specific questionnaire for financial services companies, which dives more into this issue of financed emissions and risks in the portfolio. A lot of information on the CDP website, but we rank those disclosures and a number of financial institutions receive an A from CDP listed on here. Lloyds, Citi, Morgan Stanley, HSBC and Barclays. We're not saying that those institutions are perfect, because they're not, but all of those represent really what good disclosure looks like. So if you want more information on what good disclosure looks like, you can look at the guidance and scoring on the CDP website, but also from our website, you can download those disclosures of those financial institutions to see how they are disclosing. Next slide, please. Finally, something I wanted to mention, you know, this is really a call about disclosure, but disclosure is important, but all companies and institutional investors should also have targets. How will you reduce your impact on the climate problem? And the growth of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which CDP is a founding partner of and I sit on the board of, we have seen since 2015, when almost no companies had a science-based target, now some 970 companies committed to a science-based target. That is a target in line with the Paris Agreement, in line with what the science requires for you to have your portfolio, your operations, to be operating within a safe boundary set by the science of well below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5. So there are already some 70 financial institutions, including HSBC, Allianz, AXA, and many others who've committed to set a science-based target. It's a challenge, it's a piece of work, but I would encourage you to also think about this as you think of how do you manage climate risk. One way is to ensure your operations and investments are changing to live within the science. Next slide, please. So the final slide, and really I hope helping to ask you some of the key questions. If I was a board member, I sit on some boards, but not of a large financial institution, I would ask my management, are we disclosing in accordance with the TCFD recommendations? It's a simple but fundamental question. An additional one I would obviously say is, are we disclosing through CDP with these 8,400 companies who are already doing so, are responding to the requests of our investors? Importantly, do we integrate those TCFD disclosures into our mainstream reporting? And yeah, that depends how you as the board and the management see how much climate risk is a risk to your institution, but it's certainly a question that should be asked because the TCFD recommends that integration. As a board, I think there are metrics and KPIs that you should have in place for knowing whether you're managing climate risk. What are the emissions from your operations? What are the emissions from your portfolio of investments and loan books? Are you incentivizing your management? Many companies, financial institutions now making variable remuneration bonuses partly about meeting climate targets. And finally, have we as an investment institution set a science-based target? And that was my timer for 15 minutes. So I've managed to do it on time. Back to you, Daniel.
Paul, thank you. You could almost be German, and that's a compliment. So I think this is really, really helpful, and I can only speak for our own experience at HSBC. We started TCFD disclosure 3 years ago. When we started, we set out a very clear pathway that this is a 5-year journey. So we started with qualitative disclosure, went into exposures, and we're now at a stage of scenario analysis. And I can only recommend for everyone, it was very transformational for us because as soon as you include disclosure in your annual report and accounts, it goes through the governance. You build the muscle in the organization with audit committees, disclosure committees, third-party opinions. And with that, data gets to the quality where you need it. So for us, just starting it and signing up was probably the necessary step to then build the muscle in the organization to have the right information to report. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. On the subject of disclosure, I would add that it is a journey. Companies should not be afraid to start nimble and develop disclosure over time as they build data and knowledge. One of the big issues is indeed lack of clear and consistent data, which will require time and investments to build, especially, as Zoe mentioned in the introductions of this video, as financial institutions are used to deal with macro and financial data to take decisions. But incorporating climate science into that decision-making process is still a formidable challenge. An increasing number of regulatory initiatives are helping financial sector entities tackle this issue. From the work of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure to the body of work taking place under the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance. For example, the EU Taxonomy, which banks can use to identify which of their activities are already contributing to climate adaptation and to screen new investments. The European Commission has also published new guidelines on reported climate-related information that reflect and integrate the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This is all crucial as the financial sector needs to develop a consistent module to allocate capital to support a net zero future. One of the key issues is also cooperation, and Mark Carney's Global Net Zero Alliance, launched in April, represents a coordinated effort by the financial institutions, they are the signatories, to work towards the guidelines issued by the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative. The alliance involves clear commitments on targets and on disclosure, to set clear but also gradual commitments, to publish annually progress against such commitments, to provide appropriate disclosure, but also to contribute to the ongoing development of the guidelines, and with a strong emphasis on cooperation, which in my view remains essential.